She looked at me and said I shouldn't be here. I replied, "Then tell me to leave." What happened, Annie, the first time I saw her properly? She wasn't expecting anyone to notice. She stood by the window, the afternoon sun painting her hair in streaks of gold, smoothing down the folds of her blouse with a kind of practiced elegance that only comes with years of self-possession. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, though she was quietly so, but that there was an ease to her, a rhythm that made the air feel different. I felt it immediately, though I didn't know why. I had come over to my friend's house on a lazy Saturday, intending to spend a few hours doing nothing in particular. He was out with his younger sister, leaving the living room quiet except for the soft hum of the ceiling fan. And then she was there, moving calmly, confidently, yet with something in her movements that seemed almost fragile. It made me want to look closer, but also, somehow, to tread lightly. Her eyes caught mine across the room, a brief, startled flicker. And then, in the most matter-of-fact way, she said, "You shouldn't be here." I froze, caught between surprise and curiosity. Her tone wasn't harsh, just firm, a gentle barrier that made me aware of boundaries I hadn't thought about. And yet, beneath the firmness, there was a hint of vulnerability, as though she were testing me, quietly, to see what I would do. I tried to meet her gaze steadily. "Then tell me to leave," I said, my voice calm, though my heart was beating faster than I wanted to admit. It was a strange reply, almost defiant, but more than that, it was honest. I wasn't there to intrude. I was there because, somehow, I wanted to stay. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, a mixture of amusement and disbelief, and I noticed the small details that made her human. The way her hands lingered on the edge of the table, the quiet grace in her posture, the almost imperceptible pause before she responded. "It's complicated," she said, her voice softer now. "You're my friend's age, and—" She trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. I nodded slowly, letting the weight of her words settle without trying to fill them in. There was a strange, unspoken agreement between us in that silence, a recognition that this encounter was delicate, important, and entirely unscripted. And then she moved closer to the couch, just enough that our knees brushed when I shifted slightly. I felt the warmth of her presence without knowing how to define it. The room didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt alive. Every subtle gesture, every glance, every pause in the conversation seemed to pull us closer in a way that was almost imperceptible, but impossible to ignore. By the time our initial conversation ended, I wasn't thinking about leaving at all. I was thinking about her, how her presence filled the space, how her voice lingered in my mind, and how suddenly, without warning, a simple Saturday afternoon had become something I couldn't forget. XT changed everything. After that first encounter, the room felt different, even in the hours we shared together. I noticed things I hadn't before, small gestures that seemed ordinary but carried an unspoken weight. The way she leaned slightly toward the table when she spoke, as if the world outside no longer mattered, or how her fingers traced absent-minded circles on her coffee cup, leaving a faint warmth behind. I found myself drawn not just to her presence, but to the quiet rhythm of her movements, the subtle confidence interwoven with hints of vulnerability. We talked about everything and nothing. Books, movies, trivial anecdotes from my week, and memories from hers that she shared reluctantly, like precious stones she wasn't ready to give away entirely. I listened, genuinely, because there was an honesty to her voice that demanded attention. And I realized that in this quiet room, filled with the golden light of late afternoon, time seemed to stretch. Moments became longer, breaths deeper, and every glance we exchanged lingered just a fraction too long to be casual. She shifted closer on the couch, not purposefully, but naturally, like the space itself nudged her in my direction. Our knees brushed, subtly at first, and then again when I shifted slightly to reach for a book. Each contact sent a jolt through me. Not startling, not inappropriate, just a reminder of the closeness between us. I became acutely aware of the heat of her hand resting briefly near mine, the softness of her sweater brushing my arm, and the faint scent of her perfume, comforting and warm. "Do you ever feel like you're living in someone else's story?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. I turned to look at her, noticing the gentle tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes searched mine for understanding. "Sometimes," I said softly. But maybe that's when we start writing our own. She laughed, a soft, almost shy sound, and it made the space between us feel lighter. But then she paused, glancing away toward the window, as if weighing the rules she had unconsciously set for herself. I wanted to reach out, to touch her hand and reassure her, but instead I waited. The waiting became its own kind of intimacy, an understanding that our connection didn't need force, that it could exist quietly, almost invisibly, and still mean everything. At one point, she leaned back, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. I caught the movement, felt the delicate warmth of her fingers, and realized how alive the room had become simply because we were near each other. There was no rush, no pressure, just the slow, steady pull of two people discovering a connection that neither expected but both cherished. By the time I left that afternoon, my chest ached with something I couldn't name. It wasn't longing or desire, not yet, but a deep, unspoken awareness that something important had begun, something that would linger in glances, in small touches, and in the quiet spaces between our words. And as I walked down the driveway, I looked back to see her standing by the window, the light catching her hair, and I knew that neither of us would forget the subtle, powerful pull we had felt that day. A week had passed since that quiet afternoon, and yet the memory of her lingered like sunlight through a window, soft, warm, impossible to ignore. I found myself thinking of her in small, inconsequential moments. The curve of her smile, the way she tilted her head when she was considering something carefully, the subtle grace in every gesture. It wasn't infatuation. It wasn't even entirely about attraction. It was about presence, her presence, and the strange, steady pull it had on me. I returned to her house that evening with no clear purpose other than to see her again, to feel that gentle tension we'd shared in the living room. She greeted me with the faintest raising of her eyebrows, a knowing smile that made my chest tighten. It wasn't flirtation exactly. It was recognition, acknowledgement that we both understood something unspoken. We sat together in the same spot on the couch, the room dim now, lit only by the golden glow of the setting sun spilling through the blinds. Our conversation flowed easily at first, punctuated by small silences that felt comfortable rather than awkward. Then, as if drawn by the invisible gravity of the moment, our hands brushed, lightly, almost accidentally. I didn't pull away. She didn't either. Instead, she let her fingers rest near mine for just a heartbeat longer, and in that fleeting contact, everything became clearer. There was a desire here, yes, but more than that, there was trust, understanding, and the quiet promise of something deeper. "I've been thinking about that day," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. "The day you told me to stay even when I said you shouldn't be here." She paused, glancing at me, searching my face. I've never had someone make me feel seen like that. I swallowed, my own nerves flaring in a way I didn't expect. "I wasn't trying to make you feel anything," I admitted. "I just wanted to be honest with you. That's all I could do." Her gaze softened, lingering on mine, and I felt the tension between us stretch taut, then release in the quiet honesty of the moment. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and placed her hand over mine. The warmth of her touch spread through me, not urgent, not demanding, just steady and real. It anchored me, made the world shrink until it was only the two of us, two people who had found a fragile, precious connection. "I don't know what comes next," she whispered, "but I want to know it with you." I nodded, the words catching in my throat. "Neither do I said softly. "But I want that too." We stayed there for a long time, hands touching, knees brushing, and hearts beating in quiet synchrony. There was no rush, no expectation, only the understanding that we had crossed a threshold together, a moment that neither of us could forget. And when I finally stood to leave, she followed me to the door, lingering in the hallway just long enough for our fingers to brush once more. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, looking back to see her framed by the doorway, a small, tender smile on her face. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough. Enough to know that something rare and meaningful had begun, something that neither age nor circumstance could diminish. And as I walked away, I carried with me the quiet certainty that this connection, the slow, steady pull, the warmth of a hand held just a moment too long, was only the beginning of a story neither of us could have predicted, but both of us would cherish forever. Days turned into weeks, and our connection deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was quiet, subtle, and profound. Each encounter with her carried a weight that was both thrilling and comforting, like standing in a place that felt familiar yet entirely new. I noticed the small things, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the softness of her laughter that made even the mundane seem significant, and the way her eyes would meet mine across a room, holding a conversation no words could capture. One late afternoon, I found myself back in that same living room, the sunlight now golden and forgiving, casting long shadows across the floor. She was there, seated in her favorite chair, a book in her hands, and yet the world seemed to shrink when I entered. She looked up, smiled faintly, and gestured for me to sit. There was no hesitation in her invitation, only a quiet acknowledgement that our presence together had become natural, almost necessary. We spoke less than we had in our first encounters, but each word carried more meaning. There was a rhythm to the conversation, an unspoken understanding that had grown between us. I felt comfortable enough to share thoughts I normally kept buried, and she listened, not just with her ears, but with her full attention. As though my words were precious threads in a tapestry, she was quietly weaving alongside me. At one point, she reached over and brushed a loose strand of hair from my forehead. It was a small gesture, fleeting, but it sent a ripple of warmth through me. Her touch was never hurried, never demanding. It lingered just enough to feel significant, leaving behind a sense of trust and calm. I caught her gaze, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. We didn't need words. The silence itself was intimate, a testament to how much we understood each other without needing to articulate it. "I like that we can just be," she said softly, almost to herself. "No pretenses, no expectations." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in my chest. "Me too," I admitted. "It's rare and comforting." The afternoon passed slowly, marked by small touches, a hand lightly resting on a shoulder, knees brushing as we adjusted our positions, a shared laugh over a memory from my childhood. Each moment reinforced a truth neither of us had to state aloud, that age didn't matter, that the connection we had built was meaningful in its own quiet way. When it was time to leave, we lingered by the doorway. She placed her hand on my arm, a gentle, grounding touch, and I felt a surge of gratitude for her presence. "See you soon?" she asked, her voice low but hopeful. "Soon," I replied, smiling. As I walked away, I realized that what we had wasn't fleeting or fragile. It was slow, steady, and genuine, a bond forged through honesty, shared moments, and the kind of tenderness that doesn't demand attention but leaves a lasting impression. And in that quiet understanding, I knew that whatever the future held, we had already found something rare and beautiful, a connection that was patient, kind, and undeniably ours. Weeks had passed, yet the memory of our first hesitant conversation still lingered, warm and insistent. What had begun as curiosity had grown into something far more substantial, an unspoken bond that neither of us felt the need to define immediately. I had come to understand that our connection wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It was in the quiet spaces, the fleeting touches, the glances that lasted just a second too long. That evening, I returned to her home with a sense of ease that had been absent during our first meetings. The sunlight had softened into twilight, and the living room glowed with a gentle amber hue. She was sitting on the couch, a soft blanket draped over her knees, a cup of tea warming her hands. She looked up as I entered, and her eyes held that familiar mix of quiet confidence and gentle vulnerability, the same eyes that had captivated me from the very start. We spoke in fragments, sharing the small details of our week. But the conversation was secondary to the connection that had deepened between us. Every word carried weight. Every pause held meaning. At one point, she reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from my forehead. The touch was tender, unhurried, and somehow grounding. It reminded me that intimacy wasn't always dramatic. It could be found in the soft, deliberate gestures of someone who cared enough to notice. "I feel like I understand you in ways I didn't expect," she said quietly, her voice tinged with thoughtfulness. "And I think I like it." Her words made my chest tighten, not with surprise, but with recognition. "I feel the same," I admitted, letting the honesty settle in the space between us. It's rare, isn't it? Finding someone who makes everything feel calm and alive at the same time. She smiled, that gentle, knowing smile that had become so familiar. Our hands met again, this time resting naturally against one another, fingers brushing with an ease that spoke of trust and quiet understanding. The subtle warmth of her touch carried more meaning than words ever could. We lingered in that moment, letting the silence speak. There was no rush to define it, no need to label what we shared. Just the steady, undeniable sense that we had found something rare, a connection rooted in respect, honesty, and subtle affection. It was comforting, like coming home after a long journey, and thrilling, like discovering a new path in a familiar forest. As I prepared to leave, she walked me to the door. Our fingers met again, a gentle squeeze that felt like a promise rather than a question. "See you soon?" she asked, the quiet hope in her tone echoing my own feelings. "Soon," I replied, smiling. I stepped into the cool evening air, looking back to see her framed by the soft glow of the living room. She waved, her smile lingering, and I realized that our story wasn't about dramatic revelations or sudden declarations. It was about patience, understanding, and the slow, deliberate unfolding of something truly meaningful. And in that quiet, fleeting moment, I knew with certainty that whatever the future held, we had already discovered a connection that would stay with us. Gentle, enduring, and utterly ours. By now, our interactions had settled into a comfortable rhythm, one that neither of us had anticipated but both had grown to cherish. It wasn't a story defined by dramatic events or sudden turns. It was about consistency, about the quiet ways two people could inhabit the same space and feel profoundly seen. Every meeting, every shared laugh, every brush of a hand felt intentional, even when neither of us spoke of it aloud. One late afternoon, I arrived at her home again. The sky outside was soft and muted, painted in shades of peach and lavender, and the living room glowed with the warm light of a lamp she had switched on. She looked up from her book, and the moment our eyes met, I felt that same steady pull, the unspoken recognition that had grown stronger with every encounter. We sat close on the couch, our knees brushing slightly, the physical nearness now comfortable rather than tentative. Conversation flowed easily, punctuated by pauses that weren't awkward. They were moments to simply exist together. I found myself noticing the subtle details I had learned to love. The faint smile that curved her lips when she was amused, the way her hair fell over her shoulders in soft waves, the careful attentiveness in the way she listened when I spoke. At one point, she reached for my hand without thinking, letting her fingers rest lightly over mine. It was a small, almost instinctive gesture, yet it carried the weight of everything unspoken between us. I held her hand gently, feeling the warmth and reassurance in that touch. "I'm glad you stayed," she whispered, her voice low and sincere. I smiled, squeezing her hand just a little. "I'm glad too. I wouldn't have missed this thus for anything." She leaned slightly toward me, her shoulder brushing mine, and I felt that quiet tension, the pull of closeness, the gentle electricity of being near someone who understood you without words. There was no pressure, no urgency, just the beauty of presence, of shared space and shared understanding. We talked about ordinary things, the books we were reading, small anecdotes from our weeks, things that seemed trivial yet became meaningful because we shared them together. And then, in a moment of comfortable silence, we simply held hands, letting the world outside the living room fade. There was no need to define what we had. The connection was already clear in every glance, every touch, every unspoken acknowledgement of one another. When it was time for me to leave, we lingered by the door. Her hand brushed mine one last time, lingering just enough to make the goodbye feel like a promise rather than an ending. "See you soon?" she asked, the quiet hope in her tone mirroring my own. "Soon," I replied, smiling, feeling a warmth that reached deep into my chest. Walking away into the soft evening light, I realized that our story wasn't about grand declarations or fleeting moments of passion. It was about trust, understanding, and the kind of slow-burning connection that leaves a lasting mark. Whatever came next, we had already built something enduring, a bond that was tender, real, and entirely ours. And in that realization, I felt a calm certainty, knowing that some connections don't need words to endure. They simply exist, quietly, warmly, and powerfully, shaping the rhythm of your life in ways you never forget. Time had a way of stretching differently when I was with her. Days and weeks blurred together, but each encounter left a distinct mark, a gentle warmth that lingered long after I had walked away. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It was quiet, subtle, and enduring, the kind of intimacy that grows in small, consistent moments rather than grand gestures. That afternoon, I returned to her home with no particular agenda, just the desire to be near her again. The sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, dust motes floating lazily in the glow, and she was already there, seated in her favorite chair with a cup of tea cradled in her hands. When she looked up and smiled, it felt like the world had contracted around that single moment. All the noise, the chaos, the uncertainty of life outside, none of it mattered. We sat together on the couch, knees brushing lightly, a quiet comfort that had grown natural over time. Conversation flowed in gentle waves, laughter punctuating the silences, words carrying more meaning because they were shared with someone who truly listened. I found myself noticing the details I had come to cherish. The warmth of her hand resting near mine, the soft rise and fall of her shoulders as she leaned into a story, the calm way her eyes met mine when she wanted me to understand without explanation. At one point, she reached out and touched my arm, a fleeting brush that made my heart lift. "It's strange," she said softly, "how close we've become in such a short time." I nodded, my fingers brushing hers in response. "Maybe it's not the time, but the moments we actually feel," I said. "The moments that matter, no matter how small." She smiled, that quiet, knowing smile, and I realized that our connection wasn't about passion or urgency. It was about presence. It was about being truly seen and allowing someone else to see you in return. It was the trust in small gestures, the comfort in shared silences, and the subtle thrill of a hand lingering just a second too long. As the afternoon faded into evening, we lingered on the couch, watching shadows stretch across the room. Our hands remained close, fingers lightly entwined at times, and I felt the enduring weight of what we had built. It was not fleeting. It was not superficial. It was slow, deliberate, and quietly transformative. When it came time to leave, the goodbye was soft, warm, and filled with understanding. Her hand brushed mine, lingering just enough to convey a promise rather than a question. "See you soon?" she asked, her voice gentle but full of meaning. "Soon," I replied, smiling, feeling that quiet contentment only a genuine connection can bring. Walking away into the evening, I thought about everything we had shared, the laughter, the silences, the touches, the moments of honest vulnerability. I realized that what we had wasn't defined by words or labels, but by presence, trust, and affection. Our story was a slow-burn connection, quietly powerful, and entirely ours. And in that reflection, I felt a warmth that stayed with me, a sense of fulfillment that only comes when two people see each other completely, accept each other entirely, and build something meaningful together, something that endures beyond fleeting moments, beyond age, and beyond expectation.